I want to thank everyone for coming out early for this conversation. I know this has been an incredibly busy week for so many people. The National Association of City Transportation Officials conference, many of you have been at that. The infra grants are due today. Many of you are submitting those. There was a WTS dinner last night. So thank you for being here for this important conversation. The coverage of autonomous vehicles has been increasing exponentially. You've probably noticed over the past few months, and it's really reaching fever pitch. In fact, Car and Driver just put out a special issue in November on Is Driving Dead? And so all facets of media and communications are really starting to talk about this. And as the planners and public sector employees, it's our job to think about unintended consequences, think about impacts for different advancements in terms of equity, community, land use, and intersections with transportation. So we really need to be on top of this technological advance and be part of the conversation. AVs really have the potential to be a game changer and really affect our communities, our cities, our region, and we want to be shaping that. So this is a first of a series of 3 events on autonomous vehicles, the autonomous future, and really excited for you all to be here. And now I'd like to introduce our partner at this event, the Environmental Law and Policy Center's Ellen Partridge. She's a senior fellow there, and this organization is our co-sponsor. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good morning, and I'd certainly like to welcome you also on behalf of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. This has been a great partnership with the Metropolitan Planning Council as we look at the many questions that need to be asked about this technology. It is that the technologists, within the last 10 years have been figuring out, can we do this? The Department of Transportation is looking to see, well, is it safe? But then there are lots of other impacts that we have just started to look at in the last year or two, and they're really important impacts on the environment, on land use, and the stakes are high. So this series is our effort to really raise the questions that need to be asked. So this series starts with this one. Then we have another on land use visioning, and another on is the infrastructure ready early next year. But let me introduce Mary Wisniewski, who will be our moderator. She is the transportation reporter and getting around columnist for the Chicago Tribune. She has been working on transportation issues for 25 years, probably not on automated vehicles all those times, but she is very up to speed on that. So Mary, thank you.
Good morning. When I was growing up, I spent a lot of time watching very educational television programs like The Jetsons and Star Trek, and I was really looking forward to a future where I would have my own jetpack and have robots doing all my laundry and automated cars, and I was kind of disappointed growing up that these things weren't happening right away, and now they finally are happening, and I think the idea of automated cars is coming with a lot of excitement, but also with a lot of fear. What is this going to do to employment? All these people who are dependent on driving as a way of making an income. What is this? How is our automated vehicles going to fit in with our current road structure, which is full of potholes and underfunded, and infrastructure is in bad shape? What is this going to do to our culture in terms of how to fit these automated vehicles in with other vehicles on the road? We have equity issues. We have all sorts of questions that we need to look at. And right now in Chicago, I think the response so far has been to kind of stand on this rapidly turning. You can imagine George Jetson on the conveyor belt, and they're going, stop. We need to think about this. We need to limit this. And so it's really important for urban planners right now to think about what the implications of this are. Fortunately, we have people here who are thinking about this and have been dealing with this, who know the importance of taking a minute to stop and think, how are we going to deal with this as a people? How are we going to deal with this in terms of the way that we fund our roads? And we're going to start with a presentation from Molly Pilon, who is the Technology and City Transportation Program Manager with the National Association of City Transportation Officials, and who've been in Chicago for the last 3 days discussing the future of the universe. And she is here. She works on the issues of technology and sustainable transportation. And she has a Master of Science in Sustainable Urban Development from the University of Detroit. And she's focused on the future, and she's going to start off by giving us an overview of all of the different issues that we're going to talk about here. So Molly, please come up, and let's welcome Molly.
And as Molly's walking up, I just want to make sure that we thank our sponsor, White & Company. Thank you for sponsoring this first event and the whole series. So now I'll turn it over to Molly.
Hi, all. Thank you for the wonderful introductions. I am visiting from NACTO, which is a membership-based organization, including your fine city. It is made up of 55 different member cities and transit organizations across North America, and empowers cities to lead the way on policy, raise a state of practice for street design, and puts forth a bold vision for 21st century urban mobility. So not that long ago, U.S. cities were pursuing pretty much one singular goal with their roadways, and that is vehicle throughput. Sometimes they phrase this as mobility, but this usually, and in the past, has really only been measured as relative to cars. But recently, we've seen a huge shift on the way our streets are used. And cities are at the forefront of this movement to make roadways, which make up about 80% of public space in most cities, places that achieve our many goals, such as equity and access, public health and safety, economic development, you name it, our streets need to solve that problem. And AVs have come to the table making us many, many promises. Some OEMs tell us that they will completely eliminate congestion and collisions from our streets, decrease travel costs, as well as VMT. And cities have been kind of grappling with all these wonderful things that AVs are supposed to bring to our cities. And so what we've come to is that the private sector shapes products and services, and the public sector needs to shape these outcomes. And so at NACTO, city transportation officials know that even the best products are not silver bullet solutions to our existing transportation system issues, and that these positive outcomes are really only possible with smart and proactive policy. And so cities are setting themselves up to glean the benefits from automation by shaping the street environment today for the cities of tomorrow. And so what street environments are cities to expect from this autonomous era? Many researchers and developers in this field are focused on delivering driverless cars, but not on what happens outside the windshield, the experience that we see every day as pedestrians and cyclists in our cities. And so this leaves us with graphical representations of the future reflecting this glorious congestion-free isolation. And at NACTO, we believe pretty strongly that driverless shouldn't mean peopleless. And so NACTO city transportation officials are working on using AVs to get to better places and better streets for everyone. And so just a quick update on what we also do in addition to street design is some great policy work with our partners at NRDC, Transportation for America, and the National League of Cities. And we, right now, and for the last 4 months, have been working to urge Congress to prioritize safety, preserve the authority of local government, and implement robust data sharing requirements for AV operators. In addition to that, we have been working with our cities to understand what the very pressing needs are today that we understand to make sure that we are shaping the streets of tomorrow, regardless of what technology is there. And so cities are prioritizing designing for safety on their streets and making sure that's still a priority when technology comes to us. And robust real-time data sharing is of top priority in many of our cities. Enhanced and improved transit, regardless of the mobility options that come to us, and democratized curbside uses. And so what does that mean? I will dive into each of those. So how could AVs make city streets safer? New technology could allow us to narrow the space dedicated to vehicular traffic with closer following distances and less congestion. There could not be need for more than one travel lane for private cars. And rebalancing the right-of-way away from vehicle movement means pedestrians can become the focus of street design. Today's streets are characterized sometimes by missing sidewalks or curb ramps or maybe even uneven surfaces. And NACTO has put forth this vision where flush surfaces with regular gaps for platooning vehicles and medians for refuge make city streets in the future accessible for everyone. And so how will AVs allow us to better manage our streets? TNCs and fleets today and AVs tomorrow present transportation agencies with more data and information about their streets than they have ever imagined possible. But we all know you cannot manage what you don't measure. And NACTO is currently working with the federal government and with multiple other partners, including a nonprofit out of the World Bank called the Open Transport Partnership, on creating a third-party platform to anonymize and aggregate this really important transportation data for the future from private partners that will allow us to manage our streets in real time. And so how will AVs change transit? This image should look pretty familiar. It looks like most streets in the US today, including that wonderful freight vehicle that you have somehow managed to get out of your bike lanes on Dearborn, which I was very impressed by. And in this street of today, we see that transit vehicles are operating in mixed traffic with private vehicles, significantly slowing them down and significantly slowing down and decreasing the number of people that can be moved through that space at peak hours. And so what does the street of the future look like? In the future, we hope that high-capacity transit has been given its own lane on key corridors and fixed routes. AV technology has increased roadway capacity, allowing us to give the space on the median or on the sidewalks there back to pedestrians and cyclists. And so how do cities allow us to get there? So cities can first rebalance the right-of-way for the most efficient uses now. There's no need to wait to put those wonderful transit-only lanes on your streets, and we know Chicago's been working really hard to do that. And the second call to action here is to focus on high-capacity, high-ridership fixed-route transit as the backbone of the city and the heart of the transit system. And so this means that our transit systems will look a little different than they have in the past. They could reach more people and more destinations, and cities can build on the strengths and assets that they have today, focusing on their fixed route transit and prioritizing high quality service on those routes. And as AVs make point-to-point service a little bit easier, there will be a need to focus on these flexible route services as well, which we all know you already have here. The flexible route transit should be layered onto the robust fixed route network to connect more people to more destinations, and the system should be rounded out by these point-to-point or corner-to-corner transit options, which would hopefully reduce transfer time and provide access to more destinations for more people. And to support better transit and expanding options in the autonomous future, cities are turning to their increasingly demanded infrastructure, their curbs. 10 years ago, curb space in cities was mainly considered an extension of private property, used mostly for vehicle storage, and we've seen a wonderful transformation of that curb space out here, and we think that the best is still yet to come for city curb space because of the flexibility in uses that that future technology would allow for us. So this example is of late night, and during the late night hours, that curb space sees primarily freight activity. The morning peak makes room for transit and people traveling to and from their early morning destinations. Midday sees space for people to eat lunch and socialize, pick up something at that nice farmer's market stand that I wish was outside my office. And the evening hours see more activation on the street and the curbside for people who are picking up kids from school or wanted to hang out and have dinner in a nice parklet space. And so in summary, our cities, and your city too, is focusing on preparing now by introducing smart policy and street design in these areas to use automation as a tool to work towards city goals. And so at NACTO, we learned just this week from your mayor that 21st century cities can't be built on this 20th century foundation. And automated vehicles do not have to destroy the American city or undo the great work that cities have done in the last decades. They are truly an opportunity to rebuild streets and continue to make these streets work for people. So thank you all. Oh, yeah. And so all of this great work comes from our 55 NACTO cities and transit agency members. And we recently put out this wonderful blueprint that goes through these issues in a lot more detail and is a vision for city streets specifically in those areas. And you can find it online at that link right there.
Molly, thank you for that cool look at the future. I'd like to contradict the mayor just a little bit that we're not only right now in a 20th century city, we're in a 19th century city. Because if you look at the old pictures of Chicago from the 1890s, you see these carriages and cars and trolley cars all jammed together in one space along with bicycles and people and cows and whatever. And you basically see that same vision now when you go out on the streets and you look at the buses trying to get around, the Uber cars which are parked illegally in the bike lanes, and et cetera, et cetera. And so urban planners are going to, in order to incorporate this new technology, are really going to have to look at ways now to fix the streetscape. And that leads us to our next speaker, who's really down in the trenches on this, Art Pierce, who's worked with the City of Portland Bureau of Transportation since 1998. And he's been working on this very issue and how are we going to prepare our cities for this new kind of technology and how to make the streets better for everybody, for autonomous vehicles, for transit, for bicyclists, for people who need to use the streets. I wanted to talk about that. Art was a senior capital project manager for Portland, working on projects specifically geared towards corridor development and neighborhood revitalization. And he has a bachelor in urban studies from the College of Worcester and a master's in urban and regional planning from Portland State. So, he coming to us from the West, here's Art Pierce.
All right, good morning. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Good? All right, good. So I think one of the interesting things, a lot of times there's a lot of conversation in recent months around autonomous vehicles, and some people have asked me whether I believe I'm an expert in autonomous vehicles, and actually I've been very clear to say that I don't think that I am. I think that I've worked for the City of Portland for 20 years. I think at this point I can consider myself a city expert, and I can look to technology and try to understand how that technology may influence the outcomes within my city. And so that's really what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today, is not necessarily about what the technology itself might be, but more about what it could mean for cities and how your city could be more proactive in defining that. Sure. I'll use the mic. Here we go. Otherwise, I feel like I'm in the corner. Here we go. All right. So City of Portland has taken on this challenge very explicitly, maybe. There we go.
About technology?
There we go. Look at that. Okay, that's much better. So the City of Portland, over the last year, has taken on this question pretty explicitly, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we're thinking about that. But first, I wanted to just sort of ground you in some overall context. How many people have seen the movie WALL-E? All right. With or without children, it's still a really interesting glimpse into the future of cities. And there's a couple key things that you start to think about that they're, I think, very explicitly introducing us to. One is, what does this mean for the future of societal interaction? If you're being individually transported around in your own entertainment pod, how are you connecting with other people? How is society actually staying vital, staying vibrant? How are you not just being informed by your own Facebook bubble on a daily basis, but how are you actually learning about different perspectives and different worldviews? The other is one of the basic truths of humanity, that is, if you don't get about 10,000 steps a day, you're not going to remain a healthy body, right? And so if you think about us being carted from place to place as individuals without the need to walk or bike, you're actually not going to get enough exercise to keep your body healthy, and you're going to have to be hooked up to an exercise machine at the end of the day, right? Some of it may sound a little familiar to my hotel room jogging this morning, but I'm trying not to dwell on that. So one of the great challenges for cities, and I'm going to talk just specifically around congestion because I think it is one that many people are very worried about. Our cities and our transportation systems currently are imbalanced. This is an actual screenshot of the Portland metro region at 3:40 p.m., I think it was, showing that all of our freeways are full. And part of the issue with that is that we currently have an imbalance in terms of how we look at our transportation system and also how we prioritize the use of its space. We are essentially allowing this to be a measure of individual vehicle throughput, and these are essentially a very inefficient way to move many people around growing cities. Many people may have seen the image that shows sort of how you can efficiently move 60 people, that shows the transition between different modes. So this is an example of what will happen simply if we move to an autonomous future but keep the same paradigm that we have today. So whether you're driving yourself, whether you're being driven individually by an Uber driver, or you're being driven electronically by an autonomous computerized car, you're not actually using the city streets more efficiently. You're just changing along the same paradigm. Some research that was recently done by Fair and Peers actually even predicts an even more compelling future, and one to be cautious of, that if we simply continue on the same sort of growth projection that we're heading now, we're going to see radical increase in vehicle miles traveled and in vehicle trips, and a radical decrease in transit trips. And so this really is a call to action for cities and for regions to proactively define the future that we want to see. So the City of Portland did just that, in part because we were having a lot of interest from our political side within the mayor and the city council of taking proactive stances in one direction or the other around autonomous vehicles, and that may sounds like that may be familiar to you all here in Chicago. And so we worked with the mayor to have them essentially direct us to start a smart autonomous vehicle initiative last April. And so the first key message of that is that Portland invites collaboration with the private sector to continue to test and move towards piloting for autonomous vehicles and for technology, and really wanting to invite that collaboration explicitly. The second was that we want to do that based on city-grounded principles, on the future of the city that we want to create. And so we were directed to proceed with these 4 steps: create an explicit policy foundation. What kind of city are we trying to create, and how can autonomous vehicles be part of that future? Issuing an RFI to ask for collaboration with the private sector, and then creating the specific framework in rulemaking around how will we engage and permit these new uses into the roadway. And then lastly, a public engagement strategy. It's amazing, although you all are obviously paying attention to this topic area, how many people really aren't. And so there's a need for a really robust conversation in the coming years as we start to describe how these vehicles may be included into our roadways. So Portland is known for its many, many explicit conversations over many years around what kind of future of a city do we want to become. So this is a map of our centers and corridors growth strategy, where we're trying to emphasize growth in key growth areas in terms of these centers and transit corridors, and trying to serve them explicitly with high-capacity transit and biking and walking. But we also have these high-level goals around Vision Zero, eliminating traffic fatalities on our streets by 2025. Supporting a healthy lifestyle, in part through transportation choices, making sure that we're going to be an economically vital and competitive city, but doing so in an equitable way, making sure that these benefits can be attributed to all of our citizens, not just those that have wealth currently. And then lastly, congestion and climate, making sure that we are really being intentional about how people get around, so that we are able to have the system flow smoothly and contribute benefits to climate outcomes. For us, we've grounded on, and what other cities have as well, on a new acronym. It's called FAVES, Fleet Autonomous Vehicles That Are Electric and Shared. So if you're trying to come with your one takeaway, you're like, I'm into FAVES. That can be your daily outcome. But it is really, we think that it captures a lot of those different outcomes together into one key statement. Really looking at using the city streets more efficiently, doing so with electric propulsion, but also sharing that fleet so that we're able to remedy issues around parking and other kind of vehicle storage issues. Portland also has a very explicit hierarchy for mobility. So this inverted triangle is actually in our comprehensive plan as our priorities for people movement, expressly saying that we want walking to be the most convenient and attractive mode for trips that are 1 mile or less. We want cycling to be the most attractive mode for trips that are 3 miles or less. We want transit to fill in that other network and really ground our growth strategy. And then when we were looking at where, even under the sort of greatest outcomes, where autonomous vehicles will fit within that hierarchy, we see it as fitting sort of in the middle there, just above other shared vehicles, and then no or low occupancy fossil-fueled individual vehicles as well. So for us, we are now grounded in terms of our city's outcomes on where we think autonomous vehicles will fit into that future transportation paradigm, and can start explicitly talking about how we will make it work. So Portland issued this request for information last June. We received 19 responses from a variety of types of players, both consultants who work in this space, but also technology innovators and startups who want to work on sensing technology, communications between infrastructure and vehicles, those kind of things. A lot of interest because we explicitly talked about safety and personal mobility through walking and biking. We heard responses of companies that are interested in really focusing in on how can we have a dynamic urban environment that can include autonomous vehicles and that autonomous vehicles can specifically sense and respond to. So there's companies that specifically want to try to crack that specific problem. And so we're in the process right now of reviewing those RFI responses, and we expect that we'll be moving towards an RFP stage for some partnerships for specific outcomes that we want. And then there's a couple entities that really have just asked you to use our racetrack. City owns our own racetrack as a testing and piloting facility, we think. Which is exciting, and then really is just looking for permitting for us to continue to work the process. As Molly pointed out earlier, there's a lot of conversation on what are the roles of government and what are the roles of various levels of government. We believe that there currently is and continues to be a need for action at all layers of government, that there is the need for clear guidance from the federal level, that there is the continued need at the state level, specifically in the DMV kind of environment, but that there's existing regulation environments and existing regulatory authority that sits at the local level and should continue to sit at the local level. And I think particularly around creating and innovating, piloting and testing work, that really does need to happen at the local level. That's the way we're going to best solve these local outcomes that we're looking to work on. And so we have created and have on our website a draft permitting process and administrative rule that's we're working on finalizing now that really explicitly requires a permit for the use of city streets. So this is under existing city engineer authority through home rule for Portland. And it establishes very clear in terms of criteria for what we will be supporting, but also requires information and data and reporting. So that's one of the key messages is if you have a current transaction that you're doing with new companies, you need to be requiring data sharing and information sharing. Otherwise, the cities will be left in the dark. So that's really, really important anytime you're having these kind of conversations. And I think one of the key things is you don't need all the data. What you need is key information around key city outcomes and city questions. So you don't need to ask for terabytes of information that you're not actually going to be able to handle. You need to know what is it that you're worried about. So things like disengagements and quick braking, where the people are getting on and off. How is this changing mobility? That's the types of questions that you want to be able to know as a city to be able to better plan your system. And so it also really comes, and Molly already was talking about this, sort of when you think about Molly's sort of future image that is really quite compelling for how cities' streets might function, there's a lot of questions around how this will transition to sort of city governance, city engineer authority for your local streets. How will it change our street design and parking regulations? Will there be changes in how pickup and drop-off zones? I think explicitly we really think that's a key conversation around thinking about what your streets will look like. Already, I'm sure you're experiencing with the upswing of Uber and Lyft, how complicated it is making the curb zone space and how many new conflicts we're finding between Uber and Lyft drivers, TNC drivers, and biking and walking. A really big challenge. We really need to start rationalizing that, and I think NACTO's guidance on coding the curb is a really smart way to proceed with it. But one of the key ones that I'm really gravitating towards, and I know it's a hard conversation, but it seems to be one that is starting to happen more and more nationally, is around pricing and using pricing tools to try to drive to the direction you want. So if this is the paradigm where we are now in terms of a car, an Uber, autonomous vehicle, but we know that there's a different future we want. Using pricing tools that are based on efficiency of roadway usage. So you see here the graphic with the bubbles on the left show the scale of city space that's required to transport one person by various modes. If you start to use that to drive how you're going to use pricing incentives to focus in on efficiency of use of your streets, it really starts to change your understanding of how you might bring this in. So you can be looking at congestion pricing, which is kind of the basic level that I think cities are already thinking about it, but also around the number of passengers in a vehicle. So if you're really focused on people movement, a vehicle that has 4 passengers probably shouldn't be priced the same way that a vehicle that has a single passenger. In fact, we might even at a certain point of scale want to be subsidizing certain kinds of uses to make sure that they're moving through the system effectively. And I think one of the key messages when you're thinking about basics of economic theory, one of the faults of that how many people took a basics of economic class in college, right? Is that there's a rational process where every person is able to rationally understand all of their options, and I always was really skeptical of that. But when you think about the coding of new technology, they will follow those rules. If you tell an autonomous vehicle that you want to have it choose its system use based on overall system efficiency, that's actually a possibility. Where if you tell an individual, I'd like you to make your daily mobility choices to make sure the system works the best, that's a really hard thing to internalize and understand how that might change your personal behavior. So we tried to start making this explicit, even though we know that it is a sort of a big thing to put out there. But this is actually on the left. This is a clip right from our draft permitting structure. And so we did put in infrastructure connection potential charges, congestion and efficiency charges. And we're talking about curb zone access pricing as being explicitly part of the future construct that we think is necessary to work. One of the big challenges, of course, is if autonomous vehicles don't need to park anymore. That's great in terms of some needs for parking. But for cities where a lot of our revenue comes from curb zone parking specifically, that's a really big dilemma. If we're going to turn it all into pickup and drop-off zones, that's still a use of that asset, of that infrastructure. But we don't have a pricing scheme currently developed in which we are actually able to gain revenue from the use of that city-based asset. So in terms of back to you and what you can do, the very first key thing that I think every city and region should be doing is explicitly saying, here are the city outcomes that we want to see happen, and here's the ways that we think autonomous vehicles can fit into that future, and here's the way that technology should be adapting to the future visions for cities, rather than for cities to be thinking about how to adapt to the coming of the autonomous vehicles. And really explicitly expressing that voice at the state legislatures and at the federal level. We were very successful within Oregon. I spent a lot of time driving down I-5 to Salem this summer and going and testifying in front of different commissions and hearings of saying that there is a successful process happening in Portland. We don't need preemptive direction coming from state or federal level. We're able to keep this process moving. But we're not trying to regulate things that really belong at the state or the federal level. We're not trying to define whether a vehicle has a steering wheel. That's not our role, right? We're talking about how the city streets might be used. Specifically requiring for registration and data sharing is another sort of key tenet. And then lastly, talking about financial responsibility. This is an opportunity for us to better define the financial relationship between the use of our city streets and the cost of maintaining and driving that infrastructure. So that's what I've got. Happy to be part of this conversation, and thank you all for being here. Yep.
Hey, thank you both so much for the presentation, which shows a real optimistic view. I'm a pessimist by nature, so I'm going to start off the questioning, if you don't mind. Right now, we're in a major infrastructure crisis in the country. We have billions of dollars in need. We have an outdated gas tax in this state and also federally. We're having a hard time getting the legislature in Illinois even to think about an alternative like a higher gas tax or vehicle miles traveled. And I was wondering if you both could address the problem of getting the political conversation turned around to get people to realize that the streets need to be paid for in a way to make this technology possible, or even to make driving a car possible.
Sure. This is a daily existence conversation for me, for sure. I do think being able to express some of these core tenets and the fact that with the current systems we have are not meeting our needs is the key place to start. One of the benefits, I think, around autonomous vehicles is that it's enough of a far-out future that we're able to talk about it in a more rational way than when we're trying to talk about our daily lives and changing pricing for an existing freeway that someone believes they've already paid for. So one of the benefits, I think, of an autonomous vehicle conversation is that we're able to lay it farther enough ahead of us to do it intentionally and in the right way without necessarily needing to think about what that means for the next day. It may take us 20 years to see the transition to autonomous vehicles, but if we chart the course now, we can actually see ourselves there in that future.
Okay, Molly, what do you think? How are we going to get people to talk about VMT?
I will add that starting to go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, we do have the luxury in Oregon that we already have Origo, so we already have a VMT
Yes.
pilot occurring. So we've already broken through the beginnings of that conversation. There's only about 8,000 users, I think, currently, so it's not something that has full uptick, but it is something that is specifically understood as a possibility in Oregon already.
I would add that Portland is doing some amazing work on this, and so are a lot of other cities, and starting to get mobility pricing into the conversation at incremental places. Like Art showed you some innovative curb space pricing, and so I think what we're seeing is that it doesn't have to be a full VMT charge to get this conversation started. And we've seen successful measures on pricing TNCs and pricing occupancy based on that. Some cities that are really hopeful to do that in the coming years. So I think that's kind of where we've seen the national conversation headed in the near term.
Okay, great. I would not take advantage of my role to ask another question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. The other question that I keep hearing raised by readers is concern about employment. If we have more shared vehicles, more vehicles driven by robots, or however it's going to work in 20 some years from now, what's going to happen to all the truck drivers and the cab drivers and the Uber drivers? And we're going to lose their taxes. We're going to lose that tax base. And what's the human cost here? And is this something that transportation planners need to look at, or is this an issue that's separate from what you guys do?
I definitely, NACTO does not engage directly on the labor side of things yet, but we've started to have some great conversations about for example, what does a bus driver do? Because there's a lot more that they do than drive the bus. And so what is a program for workforce training that moves more toward customer service-based people in your vehicles that you travel to work on every day? And so we're excited to start looking into that more with our cities.
That's somewhat where I was going to go as well. There is essentially a concierge or attendant type of service that we are likely to see for many years to come, as people are getting more comfortable with the fact that the vehicle's being driven electronically. So I think in the near term, there's probably a smaller transition. Long term, though, I think cities generally already need to be really focused on workforce training for the next generation in general. And I think this is a way that we need to be more explicitly thinking about how we're training our future workforce to be able to be in other roles other than simply a driver. No, it's a big issue in terms of understanding how cities will function for the future.
Okay, thank you. Well, Audrey's going to be roaming around with a microphone, so we have questions. Let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us today. I'm going to add to your skepticism. FAVES is a phrase I'm very familiar with, a fleet of AV electric shared vehicles. I'm most concerned with the shared part of it because this is a Atlantic monthly chart showing people's preferences for single occupant driving. It's very clear that people mostly prefer single occupant driving. Now we could say, oh yeah, when they're automated, then all of a sudden people will really enjoy sharing rides. But that seems totally counterintuitive because you just said a bus driver will be a concierge. But people like being alone. So I'm just going to put this out there. My preferred phrase is favorite, which would be fleet of AVs on roads increasing traffic efficiency. You see all those people in that graph where all they are stuck together? They still have to get to that bus. Okay, but if you got the traffic flowing like a bunch of bicycles, for instance, it's funny that those graphs never show a bunch of bicycles in that. So my question to you is, NATCO, what is the interest in shared vehicles? Why do you do that? Is it just because that's the current technology? And cities, would you consider highway-capable micro cars as a thing to test?
Okay, so the issue is a battle of acronyms, and favorites versus faves, and and the idea that he travels fastest who travels alone. How do you deal with that urge to want to travel alone?
I will answer that this really goes back to the infrastructure pricing and the concept that people need to pay for their use of the public right-of-way, and cities have, in Art's very well shown inverted triangle, decided, a lot of cities, that walking and biking is their priority. And so how do we shape our future streets so that walking and biking remain a priority? And to the efficiency point, we explicitly point out in the blueprint that though there is a potential for increased roadway capacity, that is not a promise. And kind of the platooning idea does take away from the walkability and bikeability of a city if you don't have certain restrictions on how those, if there's gaps in traffic for you to cross, for instance. That seems to be something that we need now and doesn't seem to be going away in the future.
Right. I think this really comes down I think there will be a variety of types of vehicle types for cities in the future, but it does come down to how do we balance the system usage more effectively. And so if we're not actually changing the paradigm if we're simply shrinking the cars some and having them platoon along a freeway. We're still using too much space per person in order to balance the system. We're still going to be needing to be spending billions of dollars on widening our freeways. And that's, at least for Portland, but I think for many other cities, a future that we don't think that we can sustain financially or in terms of societal outcomes of taking more land that could be spaces for living and playing and turning it into roadway throughput. So I think that the major challenge is that there will be a certain part of the fleet that is single use, but we need to shift the expectations around how much of the fleet can be that.
This is wonderful. I hope you guys come back like every year to give us an update.
Absolutely. All right. Yeah.
Maybe in the nicer weather. But anyway, so about 20 years ago, there was this idea of personalized rapid transit.
Sure.
Okay. And it seems like maybe we're getting back to that. So my question really is sort of planning for the future. Do you see public ownership of these autonomous vehicles? And what I'm getting at is that almost like we have Divvy here now, do you see government owning these? And then do you see things like, I used to have projects where you get a lead point by having a charging station, having a parking space near the entrance. And so I'm really curious, and we have Transit Development Ordinance here in Chicago where you can provide less parking spaces, but you have to provide bicycle parking. So my question is, and maybe this is going out a little too far, that's why I want you to come back, is what kind of things government should be doing now to prepare to have these vehicles? And then do you think that government should look to be owning these vehicles to provide that service that is not, someone told me, my car stays in the garage 23 out of 24 hours a day. Right. It'd be nice to have these vehicles
right
out there.
At least for me, I think fleets rather than is actually being agnostic to ownership. So it could be that it's a privately run system. It could be that there's public intervention for certain types of fleets that wouldn't necessarily be profitable or be efficient to be run. But I think that at least the paradigm shift that we're seeing is around fleet ownership rather than government or private ownership. But it's really, there is an efficiency, especially with electric vehicles, for them to be fleet owned because you can balance out the charging. So rather than needing each individual vehicle to be sent to its charging space at a curb zone, as we see today, the fleet could be self-balancing in terms of sending vehicles offline to go be charged and serviced before they're being brought back out to be shared again. Yeah.
Yeah, and I won't speak on the technology perspective because that's not what NACTO does, but we are engaged with a lot of our cities who are pursuing how these vehicles can meet their city goals in a variety of different ownership models. So, for example, LA Metro put out a really innovative RFP that kind of said, if you are a microtransit company that meets these goals and can work with us toward the future, like Art was saying, having data sharing as a fundamental piece of contracting with any technology company, those are the kinds of things we're starting to see, and that's kind of also agnostic to public or private.
And I think, when we're looking at the future of smart cities in general and technology in general, there's a sort of an array of public responses that go from regulating, so if we think that that may be harmful, to enabling, meaning that we're somewhat agnostic, to full-scale partnership and subsidy. So the more public outcomes that can be furthered by an introduction of technology, so if a shuttle system we think is filling a gap in terms of our equity needs for access to transit or those things, that may be a place where public intervention makes sense.
Can I ask jump in here?
Yeah.
What we're seeing right now is some very rich people who are interested in this kind of technology.
Right.
We have movie stars and people like that getting these electric cars and getting the Teslas. And I'm hearing, we want to do shared and we want to do fleets. How interested are the companies in helping to make this a public spirited enterprise? Are they willing to work with, like, yeah, we'll do electric buses, or are they saying, no, we want to be able to sell Teslas to whoever wants them, and they can watch movies in the back of their car?
In turtleneecks.
Right, they're all in turtlenecks. That was a part of a show earlier at NACTO. Is that every from 20 years ago to now, they all seem to be wearing turtlenecks in these conversations. So you're on it. Yes,
you're ahead of
exactly.
the curve.
Right, yeah. I think it really varies. I think that's actually the place where our voices can really help shape that conversation. Is the more cities, the more communities that explicitly say this is the way this industry can be a successful part of our cities, the more that's going to be part of the engineering enterprise and the business model shift that will be happening within these companies. So without that explicit direction that we need to further these outcomes, and these are shared outcomes, I think it's very unlikely that companies would be internalizing that level of public goals. Yeah.
And I'll add just from Art's presentation, actually, he put up 3 really good points of what cities should remain in control of, and that's local operations. They should be piloting new technologies with private companies and managing mobility. And that is essential to understand from all of the public sector employees here that you are still responsible for managing mobility and making sure that people get from point A to point B. And a lot of times that means the private companies will be coming to you, as we've seen with their latest and greatest shiny object. And Portland's done a really good job of saying, these are our goals, meet these goals.
Right.
And we've seen increasingly that the private sector actors who are meeting those goals are kind of within the NACTO network being promoted as the better ones to work with. So.
Okay, so you're using your platform as like, you guys want to ride on our roads, you got to, listen to what we say,
Right.
and so to take that message out there.
We're trying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Drones have come in, and drones have taken over the air to deliver goods. So do you see, and I didn't see in any of the 30-year vision that you had, that the roads are actually becoming more vertical than horizontal that you have here? So what are you doing in those terms? How are you thinking about it?
Yeah, I will jump in. We love talking about drones. Personally, I love the Amazon beehive. If you haven't seen it, I'll excuse you all to Google it now because it looks like out of some insane movie of the future. But I will say that our city departments of transportation are thinking about drones and delivery space on the public right-of-way on the street. But in the near term, we have received a lot more concern about sidewalk bots and what public right-of-way really means to private companies in that regard. And so there are a few drones in those. You have to look very closely, but it's more so thinking about, again, what Art was putting up, how you price for deliveries and for use of the public right-of-way in the future.
I have to admit, we haven't gotten as far in Portland on the specific question of drones, but I do think that actually the externality of drones is one that I think we're underestimating. If my son owns a drone, it's fun to fly it, but it is not quiet. Right? So you think about the existence on neighborhood streets with drones flying around. It may not be a peaceful environment. So I think there's a lot of trade-offs specifically to drones that I think we want to be cautious about how much we are including them. But I think you are right. There is a increasingly vertical understanding about what roadway and right-of-ways are, and that we need to be more explicit about how we think aerial deliveries may be part of that. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question over here. From Kevin?
Kevin Brubaker with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Molly, the vision you painted of the future seems dependent on new fixed guideway or fixed route transit, which raises 2 questions for me. One is, fixed route transit is really expensive. We seem to be able to afford, a few miles per generation in a big city like Chicago. So the first question is, how much does your vision really depend on massive new investments in public infrastructure? The other is, why fixed route? Why, if we're thinking about technology, why aren't we thinking more about transit on demand and deploying autonomous vehicles instead of fixed route transit?
Those are fantastic questions that we get asked all the time. So at NACTO, we provided a vision for the future, and we think that fixed route transit is essential for that vision. It moves more people in less space and will be one of the few options to do that when this new technology hits our streets. And as you will have seen, we do not discourage flexible transit, but we do see the need for fixed route transit to remain a fundamental part of the transportation system. If that means that will look different in every city, and we all know that. And so some cities will have the investments in transit that we've seen maybe in European countries more traditionally than here, but we are not saying that flexible route transit or corner to corner or point to point are not becoming more and more an essential part of the system. I think you all see that with Divvy, with bike share here. It makes trips a lot easier to connect. And so we're hoping to kind of dig into that with our transit agency members and see what that means for each of them individually.
I guess for at least in Portland, and I think it's still true in many places, our growth strategy is centered around fixed route transit locations. That's how we are directing where more growth should happen and increasing the zoning and floor area ratio requirements in those areas to really try to center the growth in those areas. And so I think we still need fixed route transit and the future locations of fixed route transit to be the anchors for those vibrant places, and then focus on the first last mile solution. So it may be that you're either taking a bike share or walking or some other flexible route to get to those fixed route transit. But I would agree, I also think that some form of high capacity fixed route systems are still needed to be the backbone of our future cities.
I'm going to add also that in the blueprint, there are several different street typologies that don't actually have fixed route transit in them, but feel free to look online.
Okay, I'd like to ask a chicken or egg question of Art. We keep hearing that automated vehicles are coming. They're coming. 20 years, 5 years. I wondered what the position of cities should be. Should we say, let's go ahead and test them now, and see how they work, and then we can use that to help plan what we're going to do with them, or should we do all our planning first and hold them back?
Right? And in Portland, we're kind of trying to do both, really. So we are trying to set that intentional framework and invite collaboration. I think the cities that are saying we're going to wait and see for the next 10 years and then join the evolution are really going to suffer as a result. So I think it is the right choice to say we're open for collaboration. What we're hearing out of our RFI process, it may not actually be a vehicle that is the first sets of testing that we're doing. It may more likely be sensing infrastructure along the streets to be able to better see pedestrians and cyclists. That's still moving the autonomous and automated vehicle evolution along. But so I think it's really being explicitly in that space and welcoming that collaboration that is the key. It's also that key to make sure that you're not preempted from higher levels of government.
Other questions?
I have another question regarding that. How much pressure, and this is a question for Molly, are you getting from, are public planners getting from, and cities getting from autonomous vehicle manufacturers that, we want this now, we want to try this now, we pay taxes for these streets, just let us on. Is this becoming a source of tension?
I think Art probably knows better than I do. He's the one who has the people banging down his door saying, we want to put this sensor here. But yeah.
No, I think it is. It's a very active conversation, and there's especially in the last legislative sessions last summer, there was conversations in every state in the U.S. around this, and pretty much in every city. I think it's hard to say how ready the industry really is versus how explicitly it's saying that it's ready. I mean, that's. I think one of the large questions, but there's very active conversations happening in every major city for certain around testing and piloting from the major automakers. That is very, very certain. This is, they are ready to start doing this process. The time scale that it'll take, which is someone else's presentation on exactly how long it'll take us to adopt it, varies a lot. It could be 30 years. But I guess, at least to me, it doesn't mean we don't want to set the intention of where we want to be in 30 years now, as we're allowing the technology to catch up.
And I'll just add a little aside to that. NACTO's president, Salita Reynolds, who works, she's a commissioner in the city of LA, has a great phrase where she says when AVs are ready for prime time, they can come test on our streets,
Yeah.
and gives like the test tracks as the highways that exist today.
Right.
And just
Right.
basically the point that these AVs, when they hit the streets, need to be just as safe, if not safer, than the current vehicles that we see every day.
Okay, you have a question over here?
Hi there. I wonder if either of you have given thought to how the automated cities of the future will interact with the suburbs of the future. And
Good
when
question.
you talk about home rule and about local initiative, how that works across jurisdictional boundaries in a region like this.
Yeah, this is a complicated one. We actually in Portland have been hosting our regional partners and together with Metro and TriMet to have some of these conversations because Portland is by far ahead of a lot of our other areas. I think we were talking a little bit earlier. There is the suburban promise actually of first last mile access that actually may have more immediate use cases than some urban environments, and certainly a suburban office park. Navigating the sea of parking or getting to those transit lines is maybe one of the near term use cases that is most approachable, more so than a really complicated downtown street. But I think the understanding of sort of what that might mean in this kind of in a much more suburban environment isn't really explicitly being talked about enough, and so we're mostly trying to make it a new conversation so that we're seeing it at a regional level, but I don't think that we've at all answered it.
I guess I will engage just to tell a little story about Vancouver, who is thinking about this pretty explicitly in terms of their new mobility pricing strategy. And they recently saw tolls removed on some of their bridges into the city, and subsequently a decrease in reliability on those roadways. And so I think that's one very explicit way that cities are thinking about connecting to their suburbs and thinking about reconceptualizing this use of public right-of-way and as a priced opportunity to access to a good.
Hey, great question. We can take one quick one before we have to wrap up. Jude.
Hi, Judith Nemeth with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Really quick question. We work extensively on electric vehicles and trying to promote that and get them on the streets. I want to know where EVs fall in the list of priorities in terms of factoring in your decision making and you guys sort of putting forth how this whole new world should look.
I think that's a really good question. I think that's very important. I mean, I think for us, that's where we see the predominance of the vehicle fleet going is electrification, and so that's definitely we're trying to explicitly say that's sort of part of that future. In terms of like we have a whole separate electric vehicle strategy around charging stations and those kind of things. One of the big challenges is how ubiquitous do we need to make charging to make electric vehicles work? And one of the benefits of fleet-owned autonomous vehicles is that brings a whole new way to think about how charging may occur. And so when you start pushing them together, there's a lot of promise, I think, to how they could work.
So are you guys actually pushing those together? Or?
We are starting to, yeah. We're kind of working them as two parallel pieces and bringing them together. But I think because in the near term we are deploying more and more charging stations around the Portland region, around the state, that is not necessarily explicitly trying to prepare for autonomous vehicle or automated vehicles. But we know they'll come together over time.
And I'll add that we work with cities who are trying to make electric charging stations more ubiquitous in their city streets, and working with different types of street furniture on very congested sidewalk areas like New York, understanding what that infrastructure could look like. And I will say that though we want also the fleet to be entirely electric, VMT is still VMT, and we still need significant behavior change to continue using our roadway space as efficiently as possible.
Good
Okay.
finish. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap up, even though this conversation could go on. I'm going to bring up Mary Sue Barrett to thank our speakers, and I'm going to thank you myself. Thank you very much, Molly and Art, for being here today.
Good morning. I'm Mary Sue Barrett, and I do have the pleasure of just wrapping us up here. First of all, thank you to all of you for being part of this breakfast roundtable conversation. You helped us fill the room at an early hour on a topic that clearly is important. To come together and grapple with issues, hear from experts, think about the agenda ahead, and then work to advance that. That's essentially what the Metropolitan Planning Council does. We're an urban problem-solving organization. We've been at this for 83 years, and we do almost everything in partnership. So some of you are here with us, perhaps for the first time. Want to raise your hand if you're at an MPC event for the first time? Welcome. Thanks to our ELPC partners who are just a ton of fun to work with. We have a number of areas where we're collaborating. And some of you are maybe new to an MPC event, but have been to ELPC events, so we're glad to bring those audiences and new people together. You heard from Audrey Wennick, our director, that this is the first of a series, a collaboration series. So stay tuned for the schedule on that next in the lineup on autonomous vehicles in early 2018. And in the meantime, I want to quickly promote a couple other things. This is a really busy time of year between now and the end of the year, but I don't want the calendar to speed by you and not have a chance to somehow participate in the Chicago Architecture Biennial. MPC's role in that is thanks to the City of Chicago's invitation as a partner on the Chicago River Edge Ideas Lab. So take a walk over to the Cultural Center, see the main exhibit, and then cross the street to 72 East Randolph, on the Randolph side. And the gallery space is dedicated to 27 really astounding visions of what our open public access riverfront might be. So nine architectural firms were asked to design for 3 spaces, and you'll see those 27 exhibits, and you'll also have a chance to list your input if you want to go online to see these same designs online as a teaser before you walk over there. It's shyriverlab.com. So those events, that is open every day, 7 days a week, but there's also events associated with the lab. 2 in November, on next Tuesday, the 7th of November, the following Tuesday, the 14th, there'll be noontime gallery talks with different architects. Each architectural firm is doing a gallery talk during this time frame. So it's just there from September to early January, so go see it and be part of another exciting future, just like AVs are part of our future that we're figuring out together. Our 150 miles of riverfront are part of our future, with many places no public access that we're all interested in changing. One more event to get on your radar. On December 7th, we have after work, our Urban Think and Drinks, which are very popular with a certain sector of folks. We're delighted to have breakfast events and Urban Think and Drinks. You can guess what time of day that is at. That's at 5 p.m. And this one is with an author, Richard Rothstein, who wrote a book called The Color of the Law. This is part of our cost of segregation initiative. And so, as you can see, we work on a broad range of issues, and we welcome you to be part of those conversations or to invite others to be part of those conversations. This morning, thanks to Molly and Art, I learned a lot. I hope you did it as well, about things that we need to be mindful of. Your conversations about preemption, about setting the agenda, about tying this to the broader funding debate, which we are in the midst of in Illinois. We just barely resolved some of our budget and school funding framework issues in the last months, and now we must turn our attention to how we invest in our infrastructure modernization. And so in the context of that, getting a jump start on these kinds of smart policies hand in hand is an exciting opportunity, I think, to bring some innovation into the mix that's often missing in Illinois. And Chicagoland is a great laboratory. So we look to Portland, we look to organizations like NACTO to inspire and to inform. Your blueprint document is just terrific. We'll do our part to promote that. And please come to us with additional ideas of wonderful speakers like Molly and Art. Mary, you are a terrific moderator. Her column is another terrific source. If you only read a couple of things, Mary Wisniewski in the Chicago Tribune is one of the places that you must read if you're going to stay on top of transportation trends. So thank you for your partnership here today and for your terrific coverage. And I hope everyone has a chance to linger for a moment, maybe meet one new person before you have to take off into your day. Thanks again to our panel, to our sponsors from White & Company, to our partners at ELPC.